Brad Levin is the director of FreeBYU, a group whose mission is to, quote, promote freedom of thought and freedom of religion at Brigham Young University. We'll talk about where BYU is falling short on that, the specific problems Brad is trying to solve, and the latest news on BYU's position. The reason I was really interested in talking to him is because I had no idea any of this was going on at BYU. And so, Brad, before we get into your group specifically, can you kind of walk us through BYU's old policy as it relates to students of different faiths? Because I always thought this was a Mormon-only school, and I only recently learned, no, there are non-Mormons who go there too.
Yeah, I would be happy to, and that's a pretty common conception since it is sponsored by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or Mormons. A lot of people think that only Mormons attend as students and are professors, but the reality is a little more complicated. There are several hundred students. I think they have about, 30,000 full-time students, and there's a few hundred at any given time that are not Mormon that are there. So you have a mix of Baptists, Catholics, Muslims, and other faiths represented.
And do these students get the same treatment as everybody else, or is there a difference in the way they are treated if they are non-Mormons?
Yeah, so there are some similarities and some differences. One of the key differences is tuition. So non-LDS students pay about double of what LDS students do. Both students are heavily subsidized, of course, the non-LDS somewhat less so. There's a similarity in that both populations, non-LDS and LDS, are expected to obey and uphold the honor code, which we'll get into some detail on. It does apply a little differently to Mormons and non-Mormons. For instance, if you're Mormon, you're expected to go to Mormon church services, attend church, and have a calling and be active in your local congregation called a ward. Non-LDS people are expected, if they do have religion, to attend their own services and to get what's called ecclesiastical endorsement from their pastor or minister. And there's some other differences as well, specifically with respect to religious freedom, which is a big thing that FreeBYU's primary mission. If you're non-LDS, you can convert, meaning, you're Baptist and you want to become Mormon, or you're Baptist and you want to become Catholic. You're free to do that. There's the population of Mormons, though, which is about 98% of the student body, is not free to convert, however. And they're subject to expulsion, termination, and eviction if they change their faith.
So just to reiterate that, because this is what really blew my mind here, if you're a Catholic student at BYU and you decide to become an atheist, no one cares. That's totally fine. You can continue being a student as usual. But if you're a Mormon and you decide to become a non-Mormon, now you're screwed. That's basically the deal.
You got it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a disparity we're trying to remedy.
Okay, so let's say you are, here's what I don't get about this. A college is supposed to be the place where you have this freedom to question your beliefs and challenge yourself. And this policy seems to say you should, expand your mind, learn all these things. But if you change your mind about this particular issue, we have a problem. And it's not just that. It's that if you're a Mormon and you become, let's say, Catholic, you don't get treated the same as Catholic students who were there to begin with. So what happens if you are a Mormon student who becomes Catholic or atheist or anything that's not Mormon?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The short answer is they can be expelled from school, so they can be dismissed from their academic programs. They can be evicted from their homes if they have BYU contracted housing, and they can be terminated from their on-campus jobs. That's the short answer there.
Have they always been like this?
No, actually. It's called the disaffiliation policy, and it was instituted in 1993. The Board of Trustees for BYU is the decision maker on honor code content, and that's when they introduced this policy.
Okay, so how many students have been kicked out? Do you have any idea as a result of this policy?
We don't know. Yeah, it's students have the right under the law called FERPA to see their own records. For instance, the honor code file, and we have an interesting story about that as well as it relates to intellectual freedom. But we as an organization and people that are outside the university and that aren't directly affected don't know. BYU doesn't publish these statistics, and as far as I know, they're the only group that would know that figure.
Okay, so how did your group come into being? Why is this such an issue to tackle now when it's been around for, I guess, more than 2 decades then, like you said?
Yeah, and it would make sense for this organization to be older than it is. Again, as you mentioned, the problem is at least a couple decades old. We came together. We're mostly a group of former BYU graduates, of alumni. I myself am a triple alum from BYU. Some of my peers are graduate, undergraduate alumni from BYU as well. And we grouped together a few years ago, and we realized several of us were interested in advocating for reform of this policy and have been affected by it, and decided to form a group and be a little bit more structured about how we went about it.
Okay, so what does your group want? What are your biggest concerns? What are your biggest demands here?
Yeah, so our mission statement is about establishing religious and academic freedom at BYU. Most directly, we are advocating for specific honor code reforms. So right now, it's an aspect of the honor code that students who disaffiliate, which just applies to Mormon students that resign from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they automatically lose their good honor code standing, which means they can't enroll in classes, they can't register, they can't graduate, and if they've already graduated, they can't receive their otherwise earned diploma. All these are automatic consequences of changing your affiliation from Mormon to something else. And so one of our key reform would be to have that clause taken out. And we're asking that students that do change their religious affiliation that are Mormon be treated just like every other non-LDS student at BYU. Pay the higher tuition. You still need to obey the honor code, but no, all it obeys. A Catholic should be treated as a Catholic regardless of whether that Catholic used to be Mormon. And we really think that's more in line with LDS principles as well that claim the privilege. They have an important article of faith that says we claim the privilege of worshiping God according to the dictates of our own conscience and allow all men that same privilege. Let them worship how, where, or what they may. And so that's our key reform, is to honor that article of faith and let people worship freely and have their religious affiliations declared without risking expulsion, termination, and eviction.
So you're asking BYU to be more Mormon?
Yes, that's exactly what we're doing.
And let's say, again, using Catholicism as an example, if a student entered BYU as a Mormon and then converted to Catholicism somewhere during their school career, would it be okay? Do you think that student would be okay saying, you know what, I'm not part of the LDS church anymore, and so, you know what, I will pay double the tuition or whatever it is and just be treated like a Catholic without the perks and privileges of being a Mormon? Do you think most students who are affected by that would be okay with that? They would be understanding of that? Or would they just lie and say they're a Mormon to get all the perks of being a Mormon?
Yeah, so it's a little bit hard to predict since that hasn't been the case. We don't know if students have really been presented with that opportunity. Judging by asking them what would you do in this situation, we do have several that said, yeah, I'd be more than happy to pay the non-LDS tuition if I could be honest about my beliefs. But far and away right now, the status quo is students that doubt or no longer believe in Mormonism or convert to other faiths, they hide it. We have well-documented examples of folks that are Mormon that converted to, say, Catholicism and Islam. We had a very kind of heartbreaking example a couple years ago of a student that converted to Islam and had to hide his daily prayers from his roommates and try to worship and follow the 5 pillars of Islam without people around him knowing. It was just a huge burden on him in terms of his mental health. But I do think that some of them probably would still prefer to fake it. But I think that most people that what we've talked to would be willing to just be treated like every other non-LDS student on campus.
Now, there's another issue here, which is that dealing with the law school at BYU and accreditation for both BYU as a campus and specifically the law school. Can you tell us about that? Yeah,
absolutely. So the American Bar Association accredits law schools in the U.S., including the J. Reuben Clark Law School. It's the BYU Law School. And one of their accreditation standards, number 205, deals with non-discrimination. And it prohibits law schools from, as you would expect, discriminating on the basis of race, sex, nationality, religion, sexual orientation, etc. Now, they have an interesting carve-out with respect to only admissions, that a school can express a preference for on the basis of religion, as long as they don't preclude admission on that basis. And it's a typical kind of lawyering debate about what exactly that means. There have been a number of scholars that have pointed out, including Douglas Laycock, who's a well-known scholar with religious exercise law, he termed it a circumlocution to try to understand what that really means. So long story short, we filed an accreditation complaint pointing to the honor code. Now, all BYU law students are subject to the honor code. Students at BYU, regardless of their graduate program, undergraduate program, are all subject to the honor code. Under the accreditation rules, if the law students are subject to some sort of campus-wide policy like the honor code, then that honor code has to comply with the accreditation standards. So we pointed out the honor code it discriminates explicitly on the basis of religion. It says right there that you lose your honor code standing if you disaffiliate. And of course, conversion is a primary expression of religious freedom. I think Universal Declaration on Human Rights, Article 18, explicitly says, changing your religion from affiliation A to affiliation B that's like the core of religious freedom, is being able to express your religious affiliation. So the honor code explicitly burdens that. There's also a burden on academic freedoms and also with respect to sexual orientation, because there's a homosexual behavior clause. Anyway, so we wrapped it all up. We documented both that the policy is there as well as that it happens in practice, because we have people that are excluded. There's a well-known published example there of a student who used to be Mormon, converted to Catholicism, applied to the law school as a Catholic, was accepted as a Catholic. The law school said, hey, withdraw your applications to these other law schools since you've been accepted here. He did so. Then the law school discovered that he used to be Mormon and withdrew his admission, which just left this guy completely out of the water. Since he'd already withdrawn his admissions to other law schools, and BYU withdrew their admission, he was stuck. And it was a really, really bad situation for him. And it's an example of the injustices that result from this disaffiliation policy.
That is horrible. So in this case, if the American Bar Association says we're taking away your accreditation, that means all of these law degrees that students earn at BYU would basically be useless. They couldn't apply anywhere. So it's up. BYU has a obligation really to the students and to themselves to make sure they are accredited.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it would apply like in a retroactive sense. And these accreditation challenges, they typically take years, sometimes years and years to resolve and that type of thing. But yeah, the consequences in an accreditation removal scenario would be dire for the law school.
So what happened with this thing? You send the ABA this information that BYU is basically breaking the rules when it comes to what it takes to be accredited. So what happened? Have you heard anything?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we've it's been about a year. So first, you're required, if you want to submit an accreditation complaint, you have to bring your complaint up with the law school directly first, which is a different rule than BYU as a general campus, because we did an accreditation challenge there as well. Pretty similar processes in a lot of ways, but that's a little different. You have to come directly to the school first. So last summer, we sent our complaint about the noncompliance with the standards and the discrimination based on the honor code to the law school. And the law school replied in a few weeks and said, we're not going to do anything. We think we're compliant. We're not going to change anything. Goodbye. So armed with that, we could take the next step, which is to file a formal complaint with the American Bar Association, which we did a few months later. So the ABA replied and said, hey, we got this. And then they have to make a decision about whether or not, on the face of it, the complaint, raises non-compliance issues. And if the answer to that question is no, then they just close the matter and say, you haven't really brought up anything that would concern us. We're not going to do anything. The other option is, if they do think it might raise an issue, then they'll ask the law school to respond. So the ABA, they read through the complaint and they said, yes, this does raise concerns. So they sent a request to BYU Law to respond to our complaint, which BYU Law did. Then the ABA reviewed that for a while, and they have another chance at that point to close the complaint and say, hey, the law school got back to us, and based on what the law school is telling us, we don't think there's a noncompliance issue, so we're going to close this. If they do think that even after reading the response from the law school, there's still a problem, then they escalate it to a group called the accreditation committee within the ABA. So there are basically two hurdles before you get to this group called the accreditation committee, and I won't go on too much longer, but suffice to say the complaint cleared the first two hurdles and made it to committee, and then the committee decided that no further action was merited and closed the complaint. And
there's no higher court to go to at this point about that?
Yeah. Yeah, you could theoretically escalate via grievance to the Department of Education, and the ABA is actually in a little trouble with the Department of Education, who's has sanctioned them, and you have some hot water there. But we don't plan to do this at this time. There's not much of a robust appeals process there. In any case, as I don't know if we're going to mention this more later, but BYU did make a change to the honor code.
So
in
let's
November.
talk about that, because this only came up this past week, even though this change happened in November. So what happened there, and why did I only find out about this now?
Yeah, so BYU did make a change in November 2015. They made several changes, actually, to the honor code. And it was to the specific clause that has to do with applications for exceptions. So let's say you're a Mormon student and you resign from the church. You can ask BYU to let you stay anyway. And they have specific kind of requirements. And under the old language, they said you'd have to prove and persuade the dean of students that you have extenuating circumstances and unusual circumstances. Now, we had mentioned in our complaint, amongst many other things, that doesn't have any meaning to a student. Like, okay, so what's an exceptional circumstance, and how do I convince you? And there was really no guidance to that. So the student doesn't have any good reason to think that they might get an exception, and there's no reason that it couldn't be completely arbitrary whether and when the dean would grant such exceptions, since there are no criteria that are stated. Well, they changed that. They took the extenuating circumstances and the unusual circumstances out. They added a couple lines at the very bottom of the honor code. They added a sentence that talked about how if you're an applicant to BYU and you're a former Mormon, that there is a way you can apply for an exception, because usually by default you can't come in. You can't be accepted at BYU
they don't
as
like
an applicant
apostates.
if you're former Mormon.
Yeah.
Former Mormons, as it says in the honor code, they're not eligible for an ecclesiastical endorsement, which is required to have good honor code standing, which is required to enroll, register, graduate, and get your diploma. So,
but Catholics and Muslims and atheists who go to BYU could still fall under that, even if they were not Mormons to begin with, I mean.
Exactly. It all depends on if you're ever former Mormon.
So the rankings the rankings are like Mormons are at the top, anything but Mormon is next, but ex-Mormons are like a subcategory that is, or a category that's even lower than that.
Yeah, that's a good description.
Okay.
So all their changes related to this group of former Mormons. So they add this clause that says, theoretically an ex-Mormon could be accepted, which, by the way, may have been the core change that resulted in the ABA deciding not to take further action, because that was probably our strongest argument with respect to compliance with the standards, is that BYU law was precluding admission to ex-Mormons, saying just because of the mere fact of your religious affiliation that you used to be Mormon, you're not eligible to be accepted. And that's still practically the case. And we're probably not going to get into the details because it's really nitty gritty, but that exception process for applicants doesn't look like it could really ever happen or would ever really ever occur in real life. But in theory, it could. It is on in their policy, and that may have been what allowed them to get that decision from the ABA. But the other changes applied to applying for an exception when you're a current student. So if you become former Mormon while you're there, you can apply for this exception. In the old world, you'd have to sign away your penitent privilege or your ecclesiastical privilege. Basically, if you confess your sins to your bishop and you're Mormon, you had to sign a piece of paper that says you can open up all the things that I confess to my bishop, and the bishop can tell you about them. So you have to forfeit that confidentiality, which is, of course, just a terrible, terrible ethically policy to require someone to sign away their confessional privilege. So they did away with that clause, which we think is an improvement. And they also made it clear at least one of the criteria to be able to qualify for one of these exceptions, and that is that you obey the honor code.
And what's in this honor code? What's in this honor code now?
So the honor code is this lengthy doc. It talks about not smoking, not drinking, not having premarital sex, not acting gay if you're gay, and not visiting after hours. It's got a lot of details with respect to dress and grooming.
When you say not acting gay, what do you mean? Like not holding hands with your partner, not like PDA with your partner, or like is there anything specific about that?
There is, and that's been a big part of the controversy with, I don't know if you followed it at all, the Big 12. So there's a football conference that's considering adding BYU, but there's a big controversy because of the homosexual behavior part of the honor code, because that part of the honor code says it violates the honor code to have any behavior that gives expression to homosexual feelings. So, if you're dating a same-sex partner and you kiss or snuggle or hold hands, then that's a violation of the honor code.
So I've seen football games where like a player proposed to his cheerleader girlfriend after they won a big game. That's okay. But if a quarterback like kissed his boyfriend after a game at BYU or something, BYU could punish the student. And the argument to the Big 12 is they shouldn't be allowed to punish the student. And by accepting them into the conference, you're condoning that sort of bigotry.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the Big 12, they have non-discrimination protections, and BYU targets gay students and punishes them for, things like same-sex dating or holding hands. And so it's completely separate double standard relative to heterosexuals versus straights at BYU. So
okay, so back to the honor code. So the honor code says you can't basically be gay in public, or at least do any actions that show you're gay, such as holding hands, kissing your partner, anything that straight couples do on college campuses regularly. And all of these things...
Private too. You can't do it in public or private.
Right.
I mean, any sort of behavior would be a violation.
And any students who go to BYU, whether they are Mormon or non-Mormon, abide by these rules.
That's right.
Okay. So what's going on with the honor code now? So they changed the honor code, like you said, back in November. How come we only learned about this now?
So FreeBYU, we'd recognize when they added that sentence at the end relative to the exceptions for applicants. I've looked online. I haven't noticed that anybody else really picked up on these changes. Typically, BYU doesn't publish. I mean, they publish them in the sense that they're available if you go to the honor code statement, but they don't make a press release or a news about it. I think the most recent change before this one was back in end of 2010 when they took out a clause that said it violates the honor code to advocate for the morality of homosexual behavior, which on a different story may have saved my bacon at the time, since I had written a book on homosexuality and gay marriage at the time. But that change wasn't announced either. There was at that time a newspaper, Q Salt Lake, that had picked up on it and included it in an article that, hey, BYU's changed its honor code. Before that, by the way, I think the previous change was in 2007, also related to homosexuality. But these changes, they aren't published in a kind of a press release. So the changes are done pretty quietly, and unless people are watching really closely, they don't pick up on them. And this particular clause, because it doesn't apply to most people, it's this application for exception process, and it's got this kind of obtuse language. Most people kind of gloss over it if they read the honor code at all, which I don't think a lot of people do. Nobody picked up on it is the main reason.
Okay, so what's the status now? What are you guys? I mean, you tried going after the accreditation. That didn't work for the law school anyway. They made some changes, like you said, that you like with the honor code, but it doesn't go all the way. What are the big things you're hoping for at this point?
So, as I mentioned before, we still want that clause taken out of the honor code that makes you guilty until proven innocent, where if you disaffiliate, you automatically lose good honor code standing. Disaffiliation should not be an honor code issue. Affiliation should not be an honor code issue. I mean, it states in the honor code explicitly that your stated sexual orientation is not an honor code issue. It should say the same thing about your religious affiliation. And really, to be true to our article of faith and the way that LDS leaders have construed religious freedom as a human right over the decades and centuries, we really need to stand behind that and honor it in practice and not just preach it. That it doesn't matter if you go from religion A to religion B or religion B to nothing. Religious freedom means that you don't lose your job, your housing, and your academic progress as a result of your stating your religious beliefs and your religious affiliation. So that clause has got to go. It would be even better to have an affirmative statement that says, your religious affiliation and beliefs are not an honor code issue. But procedurally, it needs to put the balance in favor of the student who disaffiliates. They need to be able to fill out a form that says, I don't believe anymore, I'm not Mormon anymore, and start my non-LDS tuition and start treating me as a non-LDS student. Right now, there's this cloud of uncertainty, even if students do apply for an exception, which can only happen after you've lost your endorsement, which means, you're screwed unless they grant this application.
Right. You're basically confessing that, all right, I'm not a Mormon anymore. Can you give me an exception? If they say no, then they know you're not a Mormon, so they can do whatever they want.
Right. And all the power's in their hands. There's no accountability if they deny these exceptions. And there's still all this interpretation on what does it mean to obey the honor code. Okay, The honor code says that if I'm LDS, I have to go to church services. Well, I don't identify as LDS anymore. But what if they haven't formally resigned and the church still considers them a member, even though they don't consider themselves a member? I mean, who controls the religious identity of the individual? I mean, you, me, and most people would say, the individual controls their own identity, religious identity, but arguably the folks at BYU don't. And they might say, well, you're still on our records and we get to decide if you're Mormon. And so you need to be going to church services. And if you're not, that means you're not obeying the honor code. So we're not going to give you this exception. I mean,
this is so
all these questions that aren't
unnecessarily
answered. So the student really doesn't know what they can safely do. And if they happen to fall afoul of, whatever the standard is, then they can be evicted, terminated, and expelled. And that's just a huge impact. So unsurprisingly, most of them, again, they just fake it because there's so much fear and uncertainty that they can't be honest and authentic about their religious beliefs.
This is so unnecessarily complicated. How does the school view FreeBYU? Are you guys all graduates of BYU, the ones volunteering with this organization? And do they not like you? Have you heard from BYU officials?
Yeah, so most of us are alumni. There are others that are friends, parents, current students, and people of different religious persuasions and beliefs. With respect to BYU's attitude towards us, we haven't had a lot of direct communication. We had a response from the Church Educational System Commissioner when we sent a formal letter to the BYU board a couple years back. Didn't really say anything except that, hey, I got your letter and I'm passing it around to people. Carrie Jenkins certainly has had a lot of statements about FreeBYU and responding to press inquiries. Mostly they've seemed to be somewhat critical and dismissive of both our organization and our aims. They talked about how the complaint, they claimed that the complaint had no bearing on the honor code changes that were done in November, which is, as a number of journalists have pointed out, is pretty hard to believe.
Yeah, they basically said, oh yeah, we made the change to the honor code, but it's not because of all the pressure you guys put on us. It was just totally coincidental. Yeah. Sure it was.
We haven't. Yeah, right. We have an op-ed on that at our blog from one of our members, and Jenna Reese at Religion News Service has a piece on that claim as well. But
she didn't buy it either.
Yeah, and mostly they've responded to the accreditation complaints, say, hey, we're in compliance with the accreditation things, with the standards and stuff. And so far, the accreditors have agreed with them, so you have to give them that. But it kind of misses the point, really, which is, there's all these I guess, impositions of mental health harms on people that don't deserve them. They just have different religious beliefs. And, those who are really believe strongly in the human right of religious freedom, as I think most Mormons do, would say, hey, let's take that off the table, that people can be evicted, terminated, and expelled at an accredited university just for their religious beliefs. I mean, it just doesn't make sense at an accredited university for that to be the case. And it definitely doesn't make sense at a Mormon university that has such a strong understanding and a long, advocacy and history of defending religious freedom.
Yeah, for the life of me, I cannot get behind the fact that even for a religious university, they're basically telling students, you're here at school, we want you to learn and think critically, but not too critically, because if you change your mind, we're going to punish you for it. I mean, that just makes no sense.
I definitely hear that. There was a professor last October, Dr. Wergensmeyer, who was scheduled to speak at our Religious Freedom Conference on the campus of BYU. And we reached out to him and a number of others and told him about the policy there, and he boycotted the conference. And that's what you're saying is almost exactly what he said. He's like, an accredited university, regardless of who sponsors it, if it's public, if it's sponsored by a church or some other private organization, accreditation has to mean something. I mean, these degrees are recognized by employers and people across the country. It's not like a seminary where you're just recognized by other religious groups. Any employer is going to take your degree from BYU and use it when they decide whether to hire you. And that means that accreditation needs to mean something. It needs to mean that there's a certain amount of, intellectual or religious academic freedom of inquiry. And that, if you have different beliefs than the people that are running the school, it's not really meeting the accreditation standard and what a public institution of accreditation really means and does if you're not free to come to, different conclusions in terms of your intellectual freedom. And, he took a pretty strong stand there and boycotted the conference and said, this is just contrary to what an accredited university is.
Absolutely. Good for him. All right. One last question for you. Is there any compromise at this point you'd be satisfied with, or is it kind of an all or nothing thing? They need to get rid of this a crazy rule that says you can't become a non-Mormon, otherwise you're screwed.
Well, I mean, I think what we're asking for already is a compromise. I think the hard position would be people should be free to change their affiliation and have no consequences. I think what we're advocating for is that, no, they should pay the non-LDS tuition just like the other non-LDS people there. We recognize that that's a difference of treatment. But we still think they should obey the honor code and be treated just like any other non-LDS student. So I think what we're advocating already kind of is the compromise position.
Well, Brad Levin, he's the director of FreeBYU. Their website is freebyu.org, and we'll have links to all that in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time, Brad. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.